The day I discovered the secret bank account containing $3.7 million was the same day my daughter Octavia told me I'd be sleeping in the unfinished basement during her husband's birthday celebration. "The guest rooms are for important people." "Mom?" she said dismissively, not even looking up from her phone. I remember staring at her, this beautiful woman I'd raised alone after her father abandoned us, wondering when exactly she'd forgotten who had sacrificed everything to give her the life she now took for granted. Little did she know, I had one. Final lesson to teach her about gratitude, and it would begin with the house she thought was hers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Vivian Mercer, 63 years old, and until recently, the silent backbone of my family. I spent 35 years building Mercer Pharmaceuticals from a small research lab into one of the most respected specialty drug developers in the Northeast. My late husband Nathaniel and I started it together, but after his death from a sudden heart attack when Octavia was just 7, I navigated the cutthroat industry alone while raising our daughter. There were nights I went without dinner so Octavia could have new dance shoes. Mornings I operated on 2 hours of sleep because I'd been up all night finishing proposals after tucking her in. I wanted her to have everything: the education, the opportunities, the security I never had growing up in our small rural town. And for the most part, I succeeded. Octavia attended the finest private schools, graduated from an elite university, and married Kingston, a charming investment banker whose family connections opened doors even my hard-earned money couldn't. When they were looking to buy their first home together, I offered to help with the down payment. "Just a modest contribution," I told them, writing a check for $450,000, nearly a third of the property's value. Kingston's parents covered another third, and the young couple financed the rest. What none of them knew was that I'd structured the assistance as a silent second mortgage, properly documented and filed with the county. My lawyer, Eleonora, had advised this approach. "Vivian, I've seen too many parents get burned giving outright gifts to children. Protect yourself, just in case." I'd laughed it off at the time. "Octavia would never turn on me," I insisted. Eleonora had simply raised an eyebrow and continued drafting the paperwork. That was 5 years ago. In that time, I'd watched as Octavia and Kingston integrated themselves into Boston's social elite, hosting elaborate dinner parties and weekend retreats at their sprawling colonial home in Beacon Hill, the home I'd helped them purchase. I was initially invited to these gatherings, seated at the far end of the table among distant acquaintances and colleagues from Kingston's firm. But gradually, the invitations became rarer, with excuses about limited space and intimate settings. I didn't complain. I was proud to see my daughter navigating high society with such confidence, even if I sometimes felt like an awkward outsider in her new world. The pharmaceutical company continued to thrive under my leadership, though I'd begun considering retirement. I'd accumulated substantial wealth beyond what anyone in our circle realized. The nature of my business required discretion. Blockbuster drug developments and research breakthroughs couldn't be casually discussed at cocktail parties. As a result, Octavia and Kingston seemed to operate under the assumption that while I was comfortable, I wasn't truly wealthy. I never corrected this misconception. Then came last April. I'd been experiencing troubling symptoms for months: unexplained weight loss, fatigue, abdominal pain. After numerous tests, my doctor called with results that turned my world upside down. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis wasn't hopeless, but it was serious. I would need aggressive treatment, and even then, the 5-year survival rate hovered around 10%. As I sat in my office that afternoon, staring out at the Boston skyline, I realized it was time to put my affairs in order. I called Octavia that evening and asked if I could come over the following weekend. "Actually, Mom, we're hosting Kingston's birthday celebration. It's going to be a big event. His parents are flying in, and several partners from the firm will be attending. Maybe the weekend after? Her voice had that practiced apologetic tone she'd perfected, polite but firm. I understand, I said quietly, but I have something important to discuss with you. Medical issues. A pause followed. Is everything okay? There was genuine concern in her voice, which comforted me. I'd rather talk in person. It's nothing. That can't wait a few days. I lied, not wanting to spoil Kingston's birthday with my diagnosis. Perhaps I could just stay in one of your guest rooms during the party. I promise I won't interfere with the festivities. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her mentally rearranging the guest list, trying to figure out where to place her mother in the hierarchy of importance. All the guest rooms are actually assigned already, she finally said. Kingston's parents are in the blue room. The Whitmores are taking the garden suite, and the Prestons will be in the third floor guest room. I see, I replied, though I didn't. Not really. The house had 5 bedrooms. I could take the den downstairs. The sofa pulls out. The den is being used for the whiskey tasting after dinner, she countered. I heard muffled voices in the background, Kingston, presumably, asking who she was speaking with. The phone seemed to be covered briefly before Octavia returned. Kingston suggests you could use the basement if you absolutely need to stay. We've cleared it out for storage, but there's space for an air mattress. The basement. The unfinished, occasionally damp basement with concrete floors and exposed pipes, where they stored Christmas decorations and old furniture. The basement, I repeated, my voice hollow. It's just for one night, Mom, Octavia said, impatience creeping into her tone. Or you could get a hotel. There's that cute boutique place, a few blocks away. I thought about the diagnosis burning a hole in my pocket, about the conversation we needed to have, about the decades I'd spent ensuring Octavia would never have to worry about money or security. The basement will be fine, I said finally. I'll bring my own bedding. Perfect. Come around 4 on Saturday. The caterers arrive at 5 and guests at 7. She quickly ended the call, no doubt returning to her party planning. That night, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing my will and financial documents. The company had recently received acquisition offers from 2 major pharmaceutical giants, both valuing Mercer Pharmaceuticals at just over $200 million. I'd been hesitant to sell, worried about our research staff and the patients who depended on our specialized medications. But my diagnosis changed everything. Perhaps it was time to let go. I called Eleonora the next morning. I need to make some changes, I told her. Over the next 2 days, we restructured my estate plan completely. I signed the paperwork agreeing to sell the company to the acquiring firm that had promised to retain our research department intact. The proceeds would be distributed according to my new instructions, with significant modifications from my previous plan. Saturday arrived, cold and drizzly. I packed an overnight bag with essentials, including my medications and a portable air mattress. Before leaving, I placed a thick manila envelope in my leather portfolio. It contained medical records, financial statements, and legal documents that would shape our conversation the following morning. When I arrived at Octavia's house, the driveway was already crowded with catering vans. A young man in a white coat was arranging flowers in the entryway, and the sounds of furniture being moved echoed from deeper within. Octavia greeted me at the door, already dressed in a sleek black cocktail dress, her hair arranged in an elegant updo. "Mom, you're early," she said, kissing the air near my cheek. Her eyes darted past me to the activity behind. Kingston's parents just arrived. They're settling into their room. "I can take my things to the basement," I offered, lifting my overnight bag. She nodded distractedly. "Yes, down the hall, past the kitchen. You remember, there are some folding chairs down there if you need to sit. Maybe stay there until the party starts?" Her phone buzzed, and she was immediately engrossed in a text message. "The ice sculptor is late. she muttered, walking away before I could respond. The basement was exactly as I remembered. Cold concrete floors, low ceiling with exposed pipes, the faint smell of mildew despite the dehumidifier humming in the corner. Plastic bins lined the walls, labeled in Octavia's precise handwriting. Christmas, Halloween, Kingston's college memorabilia. I inflated my air mattress in the clearest space I could find, between a broken treadmill and a stack of outdated electronics. As I made up my temporary bed with sheets and a blanket from home, I heard the house coming alive above me. Footsteps, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Music started playing, something classical I didn't recognize. I checked my watch, 6:30 p.m. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The guests would be arriving soon. I should have stayed in the basement as instructed. That had been Octavia's clear preference. But something in me, perhaps the knowledge of my diagnosis, perhaps simple dignity, rebelled at the thought of hiding away while strangers enjoyed the house my money had helped purchase. I took my medication, applied fresh lipstick, and made my way upstairs. The transformation was remarkable. The entrance hall sparkled with candlelight, each surface adorned with white orchids and silver accents. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. In the living room, an ice sculpture of Kingston's company logo stood on a lighted pedestal, slowly melting into an artfully arranged basin. I recognized few of the guests already mingling in small groups. I took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and stationed myself near a large arrangement of flowers, observing. Kingston's parents held court near the fireplace. His father Theodore tall and distinguished with a full head of silver hair. His mother Marianne elegant in an emerald gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Octavia spotted me almost immediately, her smile faltering for just a moment before she recovered. "Mom, come meet the Harringtons," she said, guiding me toward an older couple. "Philip is Kingston's mentor at the firm. This is my mother, Vivian Mercer." "Ah, the pharmaceutical mother," Philip said, shaking my hand. "Kingston mentioned you run a small drug company." "Mercer Pharmaceuticals," I corrected gently. "We specialize in rare disease treatments." "How fascinating," his wife murmured, already looking past me to someone more interesting entering the room. The pattern repeated throughout the cocktail hour. I was introduced, briefly acknowledged, then subtly excluded from further conversation. I noticed Octavia repeatedly steering me away from Kingston's colleagues and toward the older relatives and neighbors, people less instrumental to her husband's career advancement. Dinner was announced at 8. The dining room had been extended with additional tables to accommodate 30 guests. Name cards marked each place setting. I searched for mine, moving slowly around the perimeter of the arrangement. "Mom," Octavia approached, speaking quietly. "You're actually seated in the breakfast nook. We didn't have quite enough room at the main tables." The breakfast nook, a small alcove off the kitchen where the household staff would be constantly passing. Separated from the main dining area by a decorative screen. Alone. "I see," I said, meeting her eyes directly. Something in my expression must have communicated the depth of my hurt, because she at least had the grace to look momentarily ashamed. "It's just that we had to accommodate Kingston's father's request to keep the partners together, and then the seating just worked out this way. It's nothing personal." But it was personal. Every decision, from relegating me to the basement to seating me apart from the important guests, sent a clear message about my place in my daughter's life. I was an inconvenience, an embarrassment, the mother from a different social stratum who didn't quite fit into their curated world. I ate my dinner in near silence, nodding occasionally at the servers who passed. The food was exquisite. Kingston had apparently flown in a chef from New York for the occasion. But I barely tasted. It From my isolated position, I watched as Octavia charmed the table, refilling wine glasses, ensuring conversation flowed smoothly. She'd always been socially adept, even as a child. I'd been proud of that quality once. After dinner, the party moved to various areas of the house for different activities. The library had been set up for cigar smoking, the den for whiskey tasting, the conservatory for dessert and coffee. I drifted between these spaces, a ghost in my daughter's life, acknowledged with brief nods but never truly included. Around 11, exhaustion hit me. A combination of my illness, medication, and emotional fatigue. I made my way to the basement without saying goodnight to anyone. No one noticed my departure. Lying on my air mattress in the dim light, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and music above, I made my final decision. The changes Eleonora and I had discussed would proceed exactly as planned. I woke early the next morning, before the household stirred. My back ached from the inadequate mattress, and the basement's chill had settled deep in my bones. I packed my things quietly and carried them to my car before returning to the kitchen. I made coffee and waited. Octavia appeared around 9, wearing silk pajamas and looking slightly hungover. She startled when she saw me at the kitchen island. "Mom, I thought you might have left already." She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter, not sitting. "We need to talk, Octavia. Could you please get Kingston as well? This concerns both of you." Something in my tone must have registered because she didn't argue, simply nodded and disappeared upstairs. 10 minutes later, she returned with Kingston, his hair tousled from sleep, wearing monogrammed pajama pants and a Harvard t-shirt. "Vivienne," he greeted me with practiced charm, though his eyes betrayed annoyance at the early hour. "Wonderful party last night, wasn't it?" "Lovely," I agreed, opening my portfolio. "Please, both of you sit down. What I have to say won't take long, but it's important." They exchanged glances but complied, taking seats across from me at the island. "I've been diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer," I said without preamble. The shock on their faces seemed genuine. "My doctors are optimistic about treatment, but the prognosis is uncertain. I've decided to sell Mercer Pharmaceuticals and put my affairs in order." "Mom," Octavia whispered, reaching for my hand, "why didn't you tell us sooner?" "I tried," I reminded her gently. "That's why I needed to stay here this weekend." She had the decency to look ashamed. Kingston, however, was already processing. "The financial implications. The company, who's buying it? What's the valuation?" he asked. Businessman even in crisis. "Landry Biotech. The final figure is just over $200 million, I said, watching his eyes widen. "But there are some other matters we need to discuss, specifically this house." I removed several documents from my portfolio and placed them on the counter. "When I provided the $450,000 for your down payment, it wasn't structured as a gift, but as a silent second mortgage. I've decided to call that note due." The color drained from Octavia's face. "What are you talking about? That was a gift. You never said anything about repayment." I slid the mortgage document toward them. "The terms are quite clear. I've been patient, but circumstances have changed. You have 60 days to either repay the full amount plus accumulated interest, or the house will transfer to my name." Kingston snatched up the paper, scanning it with increasing alarm. "This can't be legal. We would have known if there was a second mortgage." "It was recorded with the county the day after closing," I explained calmly. "Your attorney should have caught it during the title search, but apparently he was as careless as you've been thoughtless." Octavia's shock transformed to anger. "This is because of last night, isn't it? Because we put you in the basement? That's petty, Mom, even for you." I regarded my daughter, this beautiful, entitled woman who had forgotten where she came from, who had forgotten the values I thought I'd instilled. "No, Octavia. Last night was simply the culmination of years of growing disrespect and ingratitude. the basement, the isolated dinner seat, the way you've gradually pushed me to the margins of your life. These are symptoms of a much deeper problem. So this is punishment, Kingston interjected, his charm evaporating. Your daughter doesn't treat you like royalty, and you decide to take away our home. Do you have any idea what this would do to my reputation? I'm not taking anything away that wasn't already mine by legal right, I corrected him. And as for reputation, perhaps you should have considered that before allowing your mother-in-law to sleep on an air mattress in your basement while you entertained the people you deemed important. Octavia's eyes filled with tears, of anger or remorse, I couldn't tell. We can't come up with $450,000 plus interest in 60 days. You know that. Actually, with Kingston's bonus structure and your family's resources, you probably could, I observed. But you won't have to. I'm offering an alternative. I removed another document from my portfolio. This is a new deed for the property, transferring ownership fully to me. If you sign it today, I'll forgive the second mortgage entirely. You can continue living here. As what? Tenants in our own home? Kingston scoffed. As family, I corrected. With some new boundaries and expectations, including a proper guest room that will permanently be mine, to use whenever I wish, especially during my treatment. I let that sink in before continuing. Additionally, I've revised my will. The proceeds from the company's sale will be placed in a trust. Octavia will receive distributions, but they're contingent on specific conditions, primarily related to how she conducts herself as a daughter. This is extortion, Kingston sputtered. This is parenting, I countered. Something I should have done more firmly years ago. I failed Octavia by giving her everything without expecting gratitude or consideration in return. I'm correcting that mistake now. The kitchen fell silent. Outside, rain pattered against the windows. The same rain that had been falling when I arrived yesterday with my air mattress and cancer diagnosis, ready to sleep in a basement while strangers enjoyed the fruits of my labor above me. Octavia stared at the documents, then finally raised her eyes to mine. For the first time in years, she truly saw me, not as an inconvenience or social liability, but as her mother. The woman who had built a business while raising her alone, who had never missed a dance recital despite grueling work hours, who had given her everything, asking only for love and respect in return. What happens if we refuse to sign? She asked quietly. Then I call the note due, you default, and I take possession through foreclosure. Your credit will be ruined, and the ensuing legal battle will be public, something I imagine Kingston's firm would find embarrassing. Either way, the house becomes mine. The only question is whether our relationship survives. Kingston began to protest, but Octavia silenced him with a raised hand. We need to talk privately, she told him firmly. To me, she said, give us an hour. I nodded, gathering my things. I'll wait in my car. Regardless of your decision, I have a consultation with my oncologist at noon. As I turned to leave, Octavia called after me. Mom, I'm sorry about the basement, about all of it. I don't know when I became this person. I paused at the door. Neither do I, Octavia, but I know the daughter I raised is still in there somewhere. I hope she makes the right decision today. In my car, watching the rain trace patterns on the windshield, I reflected on the path that had brought us here. I hadn't wanted to resort to legal maneuvering and financial leverage. I had wanted simply to be treated with dignity and love by the child I'd sacrificed everything for. But sometimes, hard lessons are the only ones that stick. My phone buzzed with a text from Octavia. We're ready to talk. Whatever they decided, I knew things would never be the same between us. Either our relationship would begin healing today, built on a new foundation of mutual respect, or it would fracture beyond repair. But at 63, facing a diagnosis that reminded me sharply of my own mortality, I was done being banished to basements and breakfast nooks in a house my hard work had helped provide. Some might call my actions extreme. I called them necessary, because no mother should be forgotten while she's still alive to remember. I returned to the house an hour later, prepared for whatever decision Octavia and Kingston had made. The rain had intensified, drumming against the roof of my Volvo as I sat in the driveway gathering my thoughts. I'd built a pharmaceutical empire, survived widowhood, raised a daughter alone, and now faced a potentially terminal illness. Yet somehow, this moment felt more pivotal than any that had come before. When I entered, they were waiting in the IZ living room. The remnants of last night's celebration had been cleared away, though a forgotten champagne flute still sat on the mantel. Octavia's eyes were red-rimmed, Kingston's jaw set in a hard line. "We'll sign the transfer deed," Octavia said without preamble. "But we have conditions of our own." I nodded, taking a seat across from them. "I'm listening." Kingston leaned forward. "We want a formal lease agreement. 5 years, renewable, with reasonable rent fixed for the duration. And assurance that we won't be evicted on a whim," Octavia added. "Those terms are acceptable," I agreed. "My attorney will draw up the paperwork. The rent will be nominal. This isn't about money," Kingston scoffed. "Of course it's about money. Everything always is." I regarded him calmly. "If I wanted money, Kingston, I would simply call due the mortgage note. This is about respect and recognition, something that has been sorely lacking." Octavia's posture stiffened. "You've always been dramatic, Mom. One bad weekend and suddenly, you're wielding financial power like some vengeful queen." "One bad weekend?" I echoed, the hurt I'd suppressed finally breaking through. "Is that what you think this is about?" The question hung in the air between us. In that moment, I realized how completely Octavia had rewritten our history in her mind. How thoroughly she had erased the sacrifices, the struggles, the lonely nights I'd endured to give her the life she now enjoyed. "Let me tell you a story," I said quietly, "about a woman named Vivian Caldwell, who fell in love with a brilliant but penniless research scientist named Nathaniel Mercer." Octavia rolled her eyes. "Mom, I know how you and Dad met." "No," I said firmly. "You know the sanitized version we told at dinner parties. You don't know the truth." I settled deeper into my chair, my mind traveling back 40 years to where it all began. I was 23, fresh out of business school when I met your father. He was 32, already making waves in pharmaceutical research despite lacking the funding to pursue his most promising ideas. We fell in love over conversations about enzyme inhibitors and market projections, not exactly romantic by conventional standards, but perfect for us. I smiled at the memory. What Nathaniel had was vision. What I had was $42,000 saved from my grandmother's inheritance and a knack for business strategy. Within 6 months of meeting, we were married and had sunk every penny into founding Mercer Pharmaceuticals. Kingston shifted impatiently. "This is fascinating, but..." "It's relevant," I cut him off. "Trust me." I continued, ignoring his poorly disguised annoyance. The early years were lean. We operated out of a converted warehouse in Somerville, with second-hand equipment and a staff of 3 research assistants who agreed to work for equity instead of full salaries. Your father spent 18-hour days in the lab while I handled everything else: securing patents, negotiating with suppliers, courting investors, managing the books. Octavia's expression softened slightly. "I never knew it was that difficult." "We didn't want you to know," I replied. "That was our job as parents, to shield you from the struggles while ensuring you understood the value of hard work." Paused, gathering my thoughts. "The breakthrough came when your father developed a novel treatment for a rare autoimmune disorder. It wasn't a blockbuster drug by conventional standards, but for the people who needed it, it was life-changing. We secured FDA approval when you were 4, and suddenly, Mercer Pharmaceuticals was profitable." The memories flooded back, The celebration dinner Nathaniel and I had shared at a tiny Italian restaurant we couldn't really afford, toasting with cheap wine to a future that finally seemed secure. We moved from our one-bedroom apartment to our first real house. We hired more researchers, expanded our pipeline. Things were looking up. My voice caught. And then, 3 years later, your father died. Octavia looked down at her hands. This part she knew. The sudden heart attack that had taken Nathaniel at 42, leaving me a widow with a 7-year-old daughter and a fledgling company. What you don't know, I continued, is that 2 weeks after the funeral, our lead investor pulled out. He didn't think I could run the company without Nathaniel. He offered to buy my shares for a fraction of their worth. Kingston's eyebrows rose. This part of the story was new to him, too. I refused. I mortgaged our home to buy out his stake. Instead, for the next year, we lived on the edge of financial ruin. I worked around the clock, leaving you with a series of babysitters. When I developed pneumonia from exhaustion, I still dragged myself to investor meetings, hiding my fever with makeup and sheer determination. I looked directly at Octavia. Do you remember Mrs. Fitzgerald? She nodded. The old lady who used to watch me after school. She smelled like peppermints. She charged half what other sitters did because I couldn't afford more. She fed you dinner most nights because I was rarely home before 9. When I finally secured new investors, the first thing I did was set up a college fund for you. The second was hire a proper nanny so you would never feel as abandoned as I feared you had been that terrible year. Octavia's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I didn't know. Of course you didn't. You were 8, and later when you were old. Enough to understand. I didn't want you to carry the weight of knowing how close we came to losing everything. I straightened in my seat. By the time you were in high school, Mercer Pharmaceuticals had developed 3 more successful treatments. We had a proper corporate headquarters in Cambridge, a research staff of 30, and had begun to attract attention from larger pharmaceutical companies interested in acquisitions. Kingston leaned forward, his interest finally genuine. Yet, you never sold. No, I agreed. Because your father and I had built Mercer to help people, not to cash. Out at the first lucrative offer. I wanted his legacy, our legacy, to continue independently. I smiled thinly. Until now, when circumstances have forced my hand. I stood and walked to the rain-streaked window, watching water cascade down the custom glass panes of the home I'd helped my daughter acquire. While the company grew, I made sure you had everything, Octavia. The best schools, summer programs abroad, private tennis lessons, the car you wanted for your 16th birthday. Not because we were wealthy, though by then we were comfortable, but because I wanted you to have the opportunities I didn't. I turned back to face them. Do you remember your junior year at Wellesley? The semester you almost failed organic? Chemistry? Color flooded Octavia's cheeks. Vaguely. You called me crying, convinced your dream of medical school was over. I hired the department's top graduate student to tutor you privately. 3 hours every day for the rest of the semester. It cost $14,000. You got an A- and thought it was all your own doing. Kingston looked at Octavia with surprise. You never told me you struggled with chemistry. She avoided his gaze. It wasn't relevant. No, I agreed. Just like it wasn't relevant to mention to your friends at your engagement party that your mother paid for the 6-carat diamond on your finger. The one you told everyone was a family heirloom from Kingston's grandmother. Kingston's head snapped up. What? Octavia flushed deeper. Mom, that's not fair. Isn't it? When Kingston proposed with that modest but lovely 1-carat ring, you called me devastated. Everyone in my circle has at least 3 carats, Mom. I'll be embarrassed to show it off. So I quietly purchased the 6-carat stone and had it set in the same design. Kingston never knew the difference. Kingston stared at his wife, clearly processing this new information. Octavia, is this true? She didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. I continued relentlessly. Then there was your wedding. The small family contribution I offered turned into $285,000 when you decided the Four Seasons was the only acceptable venue. The florist alone cost more than my first house. You said you wanted to help, Octavia protested weakly. I did. And I never begrudged you any of it. The education, the diamond, the wedding, this house. What I begrudge is how quickly you forgot who made it all possible. How easily you relegated me to the basement when more important people came along. The room fell silent except for the steady drumming of rain. After a long moment, Octavia spoke, her voice small. I didn't forget. I wanted to fit in with Kingston's world. His family, his colleagues. They're all so polished, so sure of their place. I was afraid if they knew too much about where I came from, they wouldn't accept me. Where you came from? I echoed, disbelieving. You came from a mother who built a multi-million-dollar pharmaceutical company while raising you alone. You came from a father whose research has saved thousands of lives. What exactly about that background were you ashamed of? Kingston cleared his throat. If I may. I think what Octavia means is that your success, impressive as it is, came through commerce rather than inheritance. My family's money is old, 5 generations of banking and property investment. There's a difference in how that's perceived. I laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. Yes, there certainly is. One fortune was built through innovation and relentless work, the other through the simple accident of birth. Fascinating which one society values more. Kingston flushed, but said nothing. He was beginning to realize the precariousness of his position. There's something else you should know, I continued, returning to my seat. Something I've never told anyone, not even my closest friends. I reached into my portfolio and withdrew a faded newspaper clipping from 1985. The headline read, Local waitress wins $175,000 in state lottery. Before I met your father, before business school, I was a waitress at a diner in New Hampshire, working double shifts to save for community college. I played the same lottery numbers every week, my mother's birthday, my childhood home's address. And one night, they hit. Octavia stared at the clipping. You won the lottery? It wasn't a fortune even then. But it was enough to pay for business school at Northeastern instead of community college. Enough to give me options I'd never had before. And later, enough to invest in your father's research when no one else would take the chance. I carefully returned the clipping to my portfolio. The $42,000 I mentioned earlier? That wasn't entirely from my grandmother. Most of it was what remained of my lottery winnings after education expenses. My lucky break became the seed that grew into everything we have now. Kingston processed this information with the calculation of an investment banker. So Mercer Pharmaceuticals, a company now worth $200 million, was essentially founded with lottery winnings? Yes, I said simply. Because I was willing to bet on your father's brilliance when traditional investors wouldn't. And after he died, I kept betting on myself, on the researchers we'd assembled, on the vision we shared. That's the legacy I built for Octavia. Not inherited privilege, but the proof that with the right combination of opportunity, hard work, and yes, sometimes luck, extraordinary things are possible. I let my words hang in the air. The revelation about the lottery wasn't strictly necessary to my point, but it completed the picture I wanted them to see, of a woman who had risen from waiting tables to running a pharmaceutical empire through a combination of fortunate circumstance and indomitable will. Octavia was quiet for a long moment. Why didn't you ever tell me about the lottery? Because I wanted you to believe success came from hard work and education, not random chance. And because the company's origin story was more impressive without that detail. Brilliant scientist and business school graduate launch revolutionary pharmaceutical firm reads better than lottery winner and researcher get lucky twice. I smiled wryly. Public perception matters in business. Something you seem to understand all too well in your social climbing. Octavia winced at the barb but didn't protest. Instead, she asked, "Does your illness, is it treatable?" The abrupt change of subject caught me off guard. Potentially. The oncologist believes aggressive chemotherapy followed by surgery could give me a fighting chance. That's partly why I'm selling the company now, to focus on treatment without worrying about day-to-day operations. And if the treatment doesn't work? Kingston asked bluntly. Kingston, Octavia hissed. It's a fair question, I acknowledged. If the treatment fails, I likely have 6 to 12 months, hence the urgency in putting my affairs in order. Including this house. Octavia's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she moved to sit beside me on the sofa. Mom, I'm so sorry. About last night. About everything. I don't know how we got here. How I became someone who would put her mother in a basement while entertaining strangers. Her remorse seemed genuine, but I'd seen Octavia's emotional performances before. As a child, she could turn tears on and off like a faucet when it suited her purposes. I remained measured in my response. We're here because success without gratitude breeds entitlement. Because somewhere along the way, you forgot that privilege isn't a birthright, but a gift. One that can be rescinded. Kingston stood abruptly. I need to make some calls. This situation changes our financial outlook considerably. He headed toward his home office, already mentally calculating the impact of paying rent rather than building equity. When he was gone, Octavia spoke more openly. He's furious with me about the diamond, about all of it. He thought my family had money, old money, like his. You let him believe that, I observed. I didn't correct his assumptions, she admitted. It was easier than explaining that my mother built everything from nothing. His family, they've never had to work for anything. They don't understand what that's like. And yet you wanted so desperately to be one of them. She nodded miserably. I thought if I could just fit into their world perfectly, I'd finally feel secure, like I belonged somewhere permanent. For the first time that day, I felt a flutter of compassion for my daughter. Behind her polished exterior and social ambitions lay the insecurity of a child who had lost her father too young, whose mother had been absent too often during crucial years. The irony, I said softly, is that I worked so hard to give you security, to ensure you would never know the uncertainty I grew up with. Perhaps I succeeded too well. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared history and mutual disappointment hanging between us. What happens now? Octavia finally asked. Now we move forward with the legal arrangements. The house will transfer to my name. You and Kingston will have a secure lease at a reasonable rate, and I'll have a proper bedroom here, the blue room, I think, for my regular visits during treatment. And if you... She couldn't finish the thought. If I don't survive, I completed for her. The house and all my other assets will go into the trust I've established. You'll receive distributions, but there will be conditions. What kind of conditions? Primarily ethical ones, community service requirements, limitations on frivolous spending, incentives for continuing your father's legacy through medical, research donations. My attorney has the details. Octavia looked stricken. You're treating me like a child who can't be trusted with her own inheritance. I'm treating you like someone who put her mother in a basement, I countered. Someone who needs to relearn the values she was raised with. Before Octavia could respond, the doorbell rang. She rose to answer it, returning moments later with Eleonora, my attorney, who carried a leather briefcase and wore a precisely tailored charcoal suit despite the weekend. Perfect timing, I greeted her. Octavia and Kingston have agreed to the property transfer, with some conditions regarding leasing arrangements. Eleonora nodded briskly. I anticipated as much and brought the appropriate documents. She set her briefcase on the coffee table and began extracting folders. "Where is Mr. Wellington? We'll need both signatures." "I'll get him," Octavia said, disappearing down the hallway. When we were alone, Eleonora gave me a searching look. "Are you certain about this, Vivienne? It's an aggressive stance." "It's necessary," I replied. "Sometimes the most important lessons are the painful ones." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. Eleonora and I had been friends since business school, and she had witnessed my journey from struggling widow to successful CEO. She had also seen Octavia's gradual transformation from bright, promising, young woman to status-obsessed social climber. Kingston and Octavia returned, both wearing carefully neutral expressions. The next hour was spent reviewing documents, initialing pages, discussing terms. Kingston negotiated fiercely on the lease agreement, securing favorable conditions despite the unusual circumstances. His legal and financial acumen impressed me, even as his obvious resentment did not. When the final papers were signed, Eleonora gathered everything into her briefcase. "I'll file these first thing Monday morning. The property transfer should be complete within 10 business days." I thanked her, and she departed with a supportive squeeze of my hand. The three of us remained in the living room, the new reality settling over us like the persistent rain outside. "I have another appointment," I said, standing. "The oncologist is expecting me at noon." Octavia hesitated, then asked, "Would you like me to come with you? To the appointment?" The offer surprised me. "That won't be necessary." "I want to," she insisted. "I should know what we're facing. What you're facing." I considered her request. Was this genuine concern or an attempt to regain my good graces now that she understood the full extent of her financial dependence? Either way, having her at the appointment might be useful. Another set of ears to process the medical information. Someone to drive me home if the news was particularly difficult. "All right," I conceded, "but we leave in 20 minutes. While Octavia went upstairs to change, Kingston and I were left alone. He stood by the fireplace, staring at the empty grate as if it might offer some escape from this uncomfortable situation. "I never knew," he finally said, "about Octavia's background, about the company's origins, about the diamond." He turned to face me. "She painted a very different picture." "I'm sure she did," I replied. "People rarely advertise their deceptions, even to those closest to them." He flinched at the word deceptions but didn't disagree. For what it's worth, I would have respected the true story more. Building something from nothing is impressive. My family hasn't created anything new in generations. We just manage what already exists. The admission surprised me. Perhaps there was more substance to Kingston than I had assumed. "Thank you for saying so," I acknowledged. "Though I suspect you wouldn't have pursued Octavia quite so enthusiastically if you'd known her mother was a former waitress who got lucky with lottery tickets." He had the grace to look uncomfortable but didn't deny it. "Will your illness affect the company sale?" "No. The preliminary agreements are signed. Landry Biotech wants our research pipeline and patent portfolio, not my personal involvement." Kingston nodded, his businessman's mind clearly analyzing the implications. "And the trust you mentioned, the conditions for Octavia's inheritance, are they negotiable?" "No," I said firmly. "Those terms are fixed. They reflect the values I want preserved, regardless of what happens to me." Before he could press further, Octavia reappeared, dressed in a simple blouse and trousers, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Gone was the polished socialite from last night's party, replaced by someone who looked surprisingly like the daughter I remembered from simpler times. "I'm ready," she said quietly. As we prepared to leave for the appointment that would determine so much about my future, and by extension hers, I felt a strange sense of peace. The morning's confrontation had been painful, but necessary. The truth, so long buried beneath social pretensions and mutual deceptions, had finally emerged. Whether Octavia's apparent remorse was genuine remained to be seen. Whether our relationship could be rebuilt from these broken pieces was uncertain. But one thing was clear: she would never again mistake my kindness for weakness, my generosity for obligation. The basement incident had been the final straw, but the cracks in our relationship had formed long before: hairline fractures caused by Octavia's growing entitlement, and my enabling of it. Now, with the house transferred to my name and my illness, forcing a reckoning with mortality, perhaps we could begin the difficult work of repair. Or perhaps not. Either way, I had reclaimed my dignity and set boundaries that should have been established years ago. As we stepped into the rain, Octavia held an umbrella over both of us, a small gesture, but one that would have been unthinkable yesterday. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. The oncologist's office awaited, with its sterile rooms and life-altering pronouncements. Whatever news I received there, I would face it knowing I had put my house in order, both literally and figuratively. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, I wouldn't be walking it alone. Not because my daughter suddenly remembered her duty, but because I had finally remembered my worth. The oncologist's office was sleek and modern, walls adorned with abstract art in soothing blues and greens, colors chosen, no doubt, to calm patients receiving life-altering news. Dr. Eleanor Patel greeted me with the practiced warmth of someone who regularly delivers both hope and devastation. I introduced Octavia, watching as the doctor's gaze flickered between us, noting our matching cheekbones and the similar way we held our shoulders. "I'm glad you brought someone with you today," Dr. Patel said, gesturing for us to sit. "Support is important during this process." Octavia chose the chair closest to mine, an unexpected choice that didn't escape my notice. For most of her adult life, she'd maintained a careful physical distance from me in public settings, not enough to appear rude, but enough to establish separation. Now, she positioned herself as my ally. "We've received your latest scan results," Dr. Patel began, opening a folder on her desk. "The tumor is still confined to the pancreas, which is good news. No visible metastasis to surrounding organs." Relief washed over me, the first positive development since my diagnosis. Octavia reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "However," the doctor continued, "the tumor is pressing against the common bile duct, which explains your increased jaundice and discomfort. We need to address this promptly." She outlined a treatment plan, a surgical procedure to place a stent in the bile duct, followed by 2 months of aggressive chemotherapy to shrink the tumor, then potentially curative surgery if the chemotherapy was successful. "What are the success rates?" Octavia asked before I could. Her voice was steady, clinical, reminiscent of how I sounded in challenging business negotiations. Dr. Patel's expression grew measured. "With your mother's otherwise excellent health and the tumor's containment, we're looking at approximately a 30% chance of 5-year survival with this approach." 30%. I tried to process this number as a businesswoman would, dispassionately, analytically. But this wasn't a business projection. It was my life. "When would treatment begin?" I asked. "We can schedule the stent procedure for this Wednesday. Chemotherapy would start approximately 10 days after, assuming you recover from the procedure as expected." The conversation continued, details of medications, side effects, and scheduling filling the sterile air between us. Throughout, Octavia took notes in her precise handwriting, asking pointed questions about alternative treatments and clinical trials I might qualify for. I observed her with a strange detachment, as if watching a performance of daughterly concern that might end when the curtain fell. When we left the office an hour later, armed with prescriptions and appointment cards, the rain had finally stopped. Weak sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the parking lot. "I'll drive you home," Octavia said, reaching for my car keys. "That's not necessary. I'm perfectly capable." "Mom," her voice was firm, "you just received a terminal diagnosis with a 30% survival rate. Let me drive you home." I relinquished the keys, too emotionally exhausted to argue. As we drove through the streets of Boston, Octavia navigated with the confidence of someone who had grown up here, though she had actually spent her childhood in Cambridge. Another small reinvention in her carefully constructed identity. "I'd like to come to the procedure on Wednesday," she said, eyes fixed on the road ahead, "and help you settle in afterward." I studied her profile, searching for signs of the calculating social climber who had relegated me to the basement. All I saw was tension around her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line of determination. More direct. "I negotiated exactly as I always have," I corrected her. "You simply haven't paid attention to this aspect of my life in years." She acknowledged this with a nod. "The company sale, it's proceeding?" "Yes, final papers will be signed next week. The acquiring CEO just wanted to confirm some personnel retention details." "And the employees? The researchers?" "Protected, as I insisted. No layoffs for at least 3 years. The research pipeline will continue under the same team." I smiled. Faintly. "I may be selling, but I haven't abandoned your father's legacy." Octavia seemed about to respond when her phone chimed with a text message. She glanced at it, her expression darkening. "Kingston?" I guessed. "Yes. He wants me home immediately. He says his parents are coming over to discuss the situation." She rolled her eyes. "Undoubtedly they've heard about the house transfer and want to offer their unsolicited financial advice." "You should go," I said, rising from my chair. "Better to face them directly than allow speculation to fester." She hesitated. "Will you be all right? After the appointment, I mean." "I've faced worse alone," I reminded her. "Go handle your in-laws. We'll talk tomorrow about Wednesday's procedure." As I showed her to the door, Octavia paused in the entry hall, studying a black and white photograph I'd had framed decades ago. Nathaniel and me standing before the warehouse that became our first lab, his arm around my waist, both of us laughing at some forgotten joke. "You look so young," she murmured. "So happy." We were. Despite the struggles, despite the uncertainty, we were building something together that mattered. She nodded, still gazing at the photo. "I never really understood what you created, the company, the legacy. I reduced it to just the money and status it provided." She turned to face me. "I think I'd like to understand it better now." "Even if it's too late?" The question escaped before I could temper it. "Is it?" she asked quietly. "Too late, I mean." I considered this. The oncologist had given me a 30% chance of surviving 5 years. The company would soon belong to Landry Biotech. The house would be mine again, but for how long? What was I fighting for now, beyond my own dignity? "That depends," I finally answered, "on what you're hoping to salvage from this mess we've made of our relationship." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze returning to the photograph. "I'd like to know who my mother really is, not just the convenient ATM I've treated you as, not just the embarrassing parent I've hidden away, the woman who built an empire from lottery winnings and sheer determination." The sincerity in her voice was unexpected. For the first time that day, I allowed myself to consider that perhaps, just perhaps, something valuable might emerge from this painful reckoning. "We'll see," was all I said as she departed. Alone in my home, I felt the full weight of the day descend. The confrontation with Octavia and Kingston, the oncologist's sober prognosis, the continued negotiations with Landry Biotech, each alone would have been exhausting. Together, they left me drained beyond measure. I poured myself a small glass of the single malt scotch I reserved for significant occasions, celebrations and devastations alike, and carried it to the living room window that overlooked the Charles River. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the water, joggers and cyclists moving along the riverbank path, their lives proceeding with the blissful ignorance of the healthy. My phone rang again, this time displaying Eleonora's number. "The documents are ready for filing first thing tomorrow," she said without preamble. "Any second thoughts?" "None," I assured her, though there have been developments. I briefed her on the conversation with Octavia, the medical appointment, Octavia's apparent contrition. Eleonora listened without interruption, then offered her characteristically blunt assessment. "Deathbed conversions are easy, Vivian. The question is whether her newfound appreciation for your sacrifices would survive your recovery. You think her remorse is calculated?" "I think," Eleonora said carefully, "that patterns of behavior rarely change overnight. Octavia has spent years positioning herself in Kingston's world at your expense. One emotional conversation doesn't erase that history." She seemed genuinely affected by the medical prognosis. Of course she was. No one wants to lose their mother, regardless of their relationship. But how will she behave next month when the initial shock has worn off? When Kingston's family is pressuring them about the house situation? When your illness becomes inconvenient to their social calendar? I sipped my scotch, considering Eleonora's skepticism. "You're suggesting I maintain the legal changes regardless of Octavia's apparent change of heart." "I'm suggesting you protect yourself first," she corrected. "If Octavia's transformation is genuine, the legal arrangements won't matter. If it's not, you'll be glad you had them in place." After we ended the call, I sat with her advice, turning it over alongside the tumbler of amber liquid in my hand. The pragmatic businesswoman in me recognized the wisdom in Eleonora's counsel. The mother in me wanted to believe in redemption. My contemplation was interrupted by another call, Kingston's name flashing on my screen. "Interesting," I answered with professional composure. "Kingston, this is unexpected." "Vivian." His voice was tight, controlled. "I'm calling about this house situation. We need to discuss alternatives." "The decision has been made," I reminded him. "The paperwork is being filed tomorrow. There must be another arrangement we can come to. My parents are extremely concerned about the implications for our financial standing." I laughed softly. "I imagine they are. 5 generations of banking and you're about to become tenants." His breathing quickened, anger barely contained. "This isn't just about the house. It's about our position in the community, our future, children's inheritance, Octavia's security." "Octavia's security," I repeated, incredulous. "The same Octavia you allowed to sleep in the basement of your home while you entertained colleagues? That Octavia?" "What about Kingston?" I asked. "Isn't Wednesday his firm's quarterly review?" Octavia glanced at me, surprise evident. "You remember his schedule?" "I pay attention to the details people share with me, even when they don't reciprocate." She winced but didn't deny the implied accusation. "Kingston will understand." I doubted this but said nothing. We drove in silence until Octavia spoke again, her voice so low I almost missed it. "I keep thinking about something you said earlier, about how I let Kingston believe we came from old money, about the diamond." She paused. "It wasn't the only lie." I waited, sensing a confession approaching. "When we first met, I told him I grew up in Beacon Hill, not Cambridge. That I attended Windsor for high school instead of Cambridge Rindge and Latin. That my father died when I was in college, not when I was 7. The words tumbled out faster now. I fabricated an entire background to match what I thought he expected. And he never verified any of this. Never asked to see childhood photos or visit old neighborhoods. I kept him away from anything that might expose the truth. When we did visit Cambridge, I showed him Harvard Square and claimed my childhood. Home had been demolished for new development. She sighed. It was exhausting, maintaining the fiction, but I was afraid. Afraid of what? That he wouldn't want you if he knew the truth? Yes, she admitted. His ex-fiancée came from a family with a museum wing named after them. How could I compete with that? I wasn't even a legacy student at Wellesley. I got in on merit and your money. Her words brought into sharp focus just how profoundly Octavia had rejected her true background. Not because it was shameful by any objective standard, but because it wasn't prestigious enough for the circles she aspired to inhabit. And now? I asked. Now that Kingston knows about the lies? He's furious, humiliated. He believes I've made him look foolish in front of his colleagues and family. She gripped the steering wheel tighter. But he's more concerned about the financial implications of the house transfer. It's always about appearances and money with him. We had reached my brownstone on Commonwealth Avenue, the home I'd purchased, after selling the larger Cambridge house where Octavia had grown up. She pulled into my reserved parking space but made no move to exit the car. "Do you want to know the most pathetic part?" she asked, staring straight ahead. I've spent so long pretending to be someone else that sometimes I forget who I really am. Last month, one of Kingston's colleagues asked where I learned to speak French so fluently, and I started to say, finishing school in Switzerland, before catching myself. The truth, that you paid for intensive language tutoring to help me, in the pharmaceutical industry, seemed embarrassingly practical by comparison. I absorbed this admission, feeling a complicated mix of sadness and vindication. You spent years being ashamed of the advantages I worked so hard to give you. Yes, she whispered. I'm sorry. For the first time, her apology seemed untainted, by calculation. We sat in silence for a long moment before I spoke again. I'd like you to come in. There's something I need to show you. Inside my home, I led Octavia to the study, a room she had rarely entered during her infrequent visits. Unlike the rest of the house, which was decorated in serene neutrals and carefully curated art, the study was intensely personal. Bookshelves lined with medical journals and business texts, awards from pharmaceutical associations, photos of research teams celebrating FDA approvals. I unlocked a lateral file cabinet and removed a thick folder labeled Contingency Planning. This contains details about the company sale, my medical directives, and the trust arrangements, I explained, placing it on the desk. You should familiarize yourself with everything, regardless of whether my condition improves. Octavia nodded solemnly, taking the folder with careful hands. There's something else, I said, moving to the bookshelf. Behind a row of financial reports was a small safe. I entered the combination, Octavia's birth date, and withdrew a worn leather journal. Your father's research diary, I explained, handling it with reverence. He documented everything, his breakthroughs, his failures, the questions that kept him awake at night. After he died, I read it cover to cover, trying to understand enough about his work to keep the company going. I placed the journal in Octavia's hands. You've never shown much interest in the scientific side of Mercer Pharmaceuticals, but you should know what your father was trying to accomplish, the lives he wanted to save. Octavia opened the journal, carefully, running her fingers over Nathaniel's cramped handwriting. I barely remember him, she admitted. Just fragments. His laugh, the smell of his aftershave. How he used to let me sit on his lap while he reviewed research papers. He adored you, I said softly. When I was pregnant, he spent hours reading embryonic development textbooks, fascinated by every stage of your growth. The night you were born, he cried when they placed you in his arms. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears. You never told me that. There are many things I never told you. Perhaps that was my mistake, believing that shielding you from the hardships of our past would somehow make you stronger, more confident. I sat heavily in my desk chair. Instead, It seems I raised a daughter who is ashamed of her own history. Octavia flinched but didn't deny it. She sat opposite me, the journal open in her lap. What happens now? With the house? With everything? Now we proceed as planned. The property transfer will be completed. You and Kingston will continue living there under the lease arrangement. I'll use the blue room during my treatments. I paused. Unless you've reconsidered? She shook her head. No. After everything you've shared today, it's the least we can do. She hesitated. Kingston may feel differently. Kingston will adapt or face the consequences. He's pragmatic enough to understand the financial realities. Just then, my phone rang. The screen displayed Landry Biotech CEO. I apologized to Octavia and took the call, slipping easily into my professional persona despite the emotional weight of our conversation. The call was brief, but consequential. After hanging up, I turned back to Octavia, whose expression had shifted, from contrition to something more complex, perhaps respect tinged with apprehension. You negotiate differently than I remembered, she observed. Harder. That was... He hesitated. A regrettable oversight. In the chaos of planning, we simply didn't. Kingston, I interrupted. Let me be extremely clear. I am not interested in your excuses or your family's concerns about appearances. The legal arrangements are proceeding as planned. You and Octavia will enjoy a favorable lease that most Bostonians would envy. Your children, should you have them, will benefit from the trust I've established, but the house will be mine. And if I contest this? His voice had hardened. If I bring in my family's attorneys? Then you'll discover just how formidable an opponent I can be, I said evenly. The second mortgage is legally binding. The documentation is impeccable. Your options are to accept the arrangement with grace or fight a losing battle that will expose Octavia's deceptions to even greater scrutiny. Choose wisely. The line went silent for a moment. Then, my parents want to meet with you, to discuss this directly. I have no interest in meeting your parents. This is between us. They're coming to Boston specifically for this. At least give them the courtesy of a conversation. I considered refusing outright, but a different strategy occurred to me. Fine. Dinner tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. I'll make reservations at Menton. Kingston sounded surprised by my acquiescence. Thank you. I'll let them know. After ending the call, I immediately contacted the manager at Menton, one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants, where I had cultivated a relationship over many business dinners through the years. I requested a private dining room and made specific arrangements for the evening. If Theodore and Marianne Wellington wanted to meet the woman reclaiming their son's house, they would encounter not a sickly cancer patient they could intimidate, but the formidable CEO who had built a $200 million company from scratch. The next morning brought a text from Octavia. Kingston told me about dinner tonight. Are you sure this is wise? His parents can be difficult. I replied simply, I've handled difficult people my entire career. The day passed in a flurry of practical arrangements, a meeting with my financial advisor about liquidating, certain investments to cover potential treatment costs, a visit from the house cleaning service, and a detailed conversation with my assistant at Mercer Pharmaceuticals about transition protocols for the company acquisition. By 6 that evening, I was in the capable hands of my longtime hairstylist and makeup artist, who had arrived at my home with clear instructions. Create a look of understated power. No hints of illness or fragility could be visible to the Wellington family. I selected a custom-tailored Chanel suit in deep burgundy, accessorized with my signature pearl and diamond earrings, the first significant jewelry I had purchased for myself after Mercer Pharmaceuticals received FDA approval for our breakthrough drug. Around my neck, the platinum pendant Nathaniel had given me on our 10th anniversary. Simple, elegant, intensely meaningful. When my town car arrived at Menton at precisely 7:45, I was the embodiment of composed authority. The maitre d' greeted me by name and escorted me to the private dining room, where a bottle of Krug Grande Cuvée was already chilling. I had deliberately arrived early to establish the terrain as mine. At 8 sharp, the Wellingtons entered. All 3 generations. Kingston led the procession, followed by his parents and, surprisingly, Octavia. I rose to greet them with professional warmth, noting Theodore's approving glance at the champagne and Marianne's swift assessment of my attire. "Mrs. Wellington, Mr. Wellington," I said, offering my hand first to Marianne, a subtle power move. That didn't go unnoticed. "Thank you for making time during your visit to Boston." "Ms. Mercer," Theodore responded, emphasizing my unmarried title slightly. We felt this situation warranted direct communication. "Indeed," I gestured toward the table. "Shall we?" The seating had been carefully arranged. I took the head position, with Octavia to my right and Theodore to my left, placing Kingston and Marianne furthest from me. Another subtle assertion of control. The sommelier appeared to pour the champagne. After we had each been served, Theodore raised his glass in what appeared to be a toast, but was clearly a prelude to negotiation. To finding an amicable resolution to our misunderstanding. I smiled thinly. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Wellington. Only legal clarity." Theodore's expression tightened, but before he could respond, the first course arrived. A delicate seafood preparation that required attention. I had deliberately ordered a tasting menu with numerous courses, ensuring the evening would be punctuated by the rhythm of service rather than allowing for extended confrontation. Between the first and second courses, Marianne leaned forward. "Vivienne, may I call you Vivienne? We understand you're facing some health challenges. Please know you have our sympathy." The statement was delivered with practiced sincerity. That didn't reach her eyes. Before I could respond, Octavia interjected. "Mom has pancreatic cancer, stage 3. She's beginning treatment this week." The blunt delivery silenced the table. Kingston looked uncomfortable, Theodore calculating, Marianne momentarily caught off guard by the direct acknowledgement of mortality at her elegant dinner. "I'm sorry to hear that," Theodore finally said, his tone suggesting he was reassessing his approach. "All the more reason, perhaps, to avoid unnecessary stress and legal complications." "On the contrary," I replied smoothly, "my diagnosis has simply accelerated plans I should have implemented years ago, including reclaiming property that rightfully belongs under my control." Kingston shifted in his seat. "Vivienne, we were hoping to discuss a compromise. Perhaps a structured buyout of your interest in the house over time, rather than this complete transfer of ownership." "A reasonable suggestion," I acknowledged, "if this were merely a financial transaction. But as I explained to Octavia, this is about more than money." The second course arrived, a truffle risotto that momentarily diverted attention. I observed the Wellingtons as they ate, noting the family dynamics. Theodore dominated. Marianne, strategically supported, Kingston deferred while attempting to maintain dignity. Octavia sat stiffly beside me, barely touching her food, her gaze alternating between her plate and my face. As the meal progressed through its elaborate choreography, Theodore made several more attempts at negotiation, each more direct than the last. By the fifth course, his patience had visibly thinned. "Let's speak plainly," he said, setting down his fork with controlled precision. "What will it take to resolve this situation? Name your price." I regarded him calmly. "Mr. Wellington, you seem to be under the impression that this is a negotiation. It is not. The property transfer will be completed tomorrow. The lease terms are generous and fixed. Your son and daughter-in-law will continue living in the house under these new arrangements." "And when you pass?" The question came from Marianne, delivered with calculated delicacy. What happens to the property then? Octavia inhaled sharply at the naked presumption, but I remained unfazed. The house will become part of the trust I've established. Its disposition will depend on several factors, including how Octavia conducts herself in the coming months. Theodore's eyes narrowed. You're using the property to control your daughter's behavior? That seems rather manipulative. I smiled without warmth. An interesting observation from a man whose family has used financial leverage to maintain social control for 5 generations. Kingston coughed uncomfortably while Marianne's perfectly composed expression faltered momentarily. You misunderstand our family's legacy, Theodore countered. We've preserved wealth through careful stewardship and strategic alliances. There's no manipulation involved. Isn't there? I asked mildly. Kingston, didn't you mention that your trust fund distributions are contingent on employment at the family firm? That leaving banking would result in significant financial penalties? Kingston's complexion reddened. That's different. It's about maintaining family tradition. How fascinating that when wealthy families establish conditions for inheritance, it's preserving legacy, but when I do the same, it's manipulation. I signaled the server for the next course. Perhaps we're not so different after all, Mr. Wellington. The distinction seems to be primarily in how many generations separate us from our lottery tickets. Theodore nearly choked on his wine. Excuse me? Mom, Octavia murmured warningly, but I ignored her. Your family wealth originated with a lucky investment in railroad stocks in the 1880s, if I recall correctly from Kingston's enthusiastic family history lessons at our first meeting. My wealth originated with a lucky set of numbers in the state. Lottery. Both were chance occurrences leveraged through strategic reinvestment. The primary difference is that I'm honest about my origins. The silence that followed was exquisite. A perfect moment of discomfort I savored like the fine wine in my glass. The dessert course arrived, an elaborate architectural creation of chocolate and caramel that seemed too beautiful to disturb. As the server described the components with practiced enthusiasm, I observed the Wellington family's reactions to my revelation about their railroad fortune. Theodore's jaw remained tight, Marianne's smile had turned brittle, and Kingston stared at his plate with the rigid posture of someone enduring rather than enjoying a meal. Only Octavia seemed unaffected, watching me with an expression that hovered between concern and admiration. When our eyes met briefly, she gave me the smallest nod, a gesture of solidarity I hadn't expected. Regardless of origins, Theodore finally said, breaking the tense silence, wealth properly managed creates security for future generations. That's what we've done. That's what Kingston and Octavia are attempting to do with their home. Your actions threaten that security. No, I corrected him. My actions ensure the property remains within my control during a critical health crisis and beyond. The security of your son and my daughter is addressed through the lease agreement. Their children's futures are protected through the trust. Nothing has been threatened except perhaps their pride and your family's social positioning. Theodore set down his dessert fork with controlled precision. You seem determined to proceed regardless of our concerns. Yes, I agreed simply. I am. We finished the meal with stilted conversation about neutral topics. The unseasonably warm weather, an exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts, the renovation of the public garden. When the check arrived, Theodore reached for it, but I had already arranged for payment. My invitation, my responsibility, I said firmly, signing the receipt. Outside the restaurant, the valet brought around my town car first, another prearranged detail. As we prepared to part ways, Theodore made one final attempt. Vivian, I hope you'll reconsider. Family relationships are precious, especially in times of health crises. This legal maneuver can only create lasting resentment. I met his gaze directly. The resentment began when my daughter put me in a basement while entertaining your family, in the upper floors of a home I helped purchase. Everything since has merely been correction, not instigation. Before he could respond, I turned to Octavia. I'll expect you tomorrow at 9 for the hospital appointment. Please be prompt. Without waiting for confirmation, I entered my car and departed, leaving the Wellington family standing on the sidewalk in various states of discomfort and frustration. As we pulled away, I caught a glimpse of Octavia in the side mirror, her expression unreadable in the dim evening light. The stent procedure on Wednesday proceeded without complications. I awoke from sedation to find Octavia sitting beside my hospital bed, her laptop open, working remotely while monitoring my recovery. When she noticed I was conscious, she set aside her computer and leaned forward. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone rearranged my internal organs," I replied groggily. "But the discomfort is already less than before." The bile duct blockage was becoming quite painful. She nodded, pouring a small cup of water and helping me sip it through a straw. "The doctor said everything went perfectly. You should experience significant relief from the jaundice and abdominal pain within days." I studied her as my mind cleared from the anesthesia. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, a stark contrast to her usual polished appearance. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, suggesting she hadn't slept well. "Kingston didn't come," I observed, noting his absence. "No," she confirmed. "He's handling the paperwork for the property transfer. Eleonora insisted on his presence for the final signatures." This surprised me, both that Kingston would voluntarily participate in the transfer process and that he would prioritize it over supporting Octavia during my procedure. Perhaps Eleonora had strategically scheduled the signing to ensure minimal interference. "His parents?" I asked, suspecting the answer. "Returned to New York this morning. They were displeased with how dinner unfolded." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I don't think anyone has spoken to them quite so directly in decades." I adjusted my position in the hospital bed, wincing slightly at the movement. "And you? Are you also displeased?" She considered the question carefully. "I'm conflicted. Part of me understands your actions and even admires the strength behind them. Another part feels humiliated that our relationship deteriorated to the point where such measures became necessary." She met my gaze directly. "But I'm not displeased. I think perhaps this was inevitable, a reckoning long overdue." Before I could respond, the attending physician arrived to check my vital signs and review post-procedure care instructions. Octavia listened attentively, asking detailed questions about medication schedules and potential side effects. She took notes in the same precise handwriting I had observed at the oncologist's office, practical, methodical attention I hadn't expected from her. When the doctor departed, Octavia resumed our conversation as if there had been no interruption. "What happens next, Mom? With the house, with treatment, with us?" "The property transfer will be completed today. You and Kingston will receive the lease agreement for review tomorrow." I shifted again, seeking a more comfortable position. "As for treatment, chemotherapy begins next week, an aggressive protocol that will leave me significantly weakened. I've arranged for home healthcare assistance." "I could help," she offered, quietly, "at least on weekends and evenings after work." I regarded her skeptically. "Your social calendar is typically quite full." "I've canceled most engagements for the foreseeable future," she replied. "Some things are more important than charity galas and dinner parties." The sentiment was correct, but I remained dubious about its longevity. "We'll see how you feel after a few weeks of playing nurse to a cancer patient. The reality is considerably less noble than the intention." She accepted this assessment without argument. "And us? Where do we go from here?" It was the question that had lingered beneath all our interactions since the basement incident. The fundamental uncertainty about whether our relationship could be salvaged after years of drift followed by days of confrontation. That depends entirely on whether your current contrition is genuine and lasting, I said frankly. I've watched you perform remorse before, Octavia. You were always skilled at it, even as a child. The tears, the promises, the temporary improvement, all eventually giving way to old patterns. She flinched at the assessment but didn't deny it. I deserve that. But people can change when forced to confront their failures directly. Perhaps, I conceded. Time will tell. A nurse entered to adjust my IV medication, temporarily halting our conversation. When we were alone again, Octavia spoke with unexpected vulnerability. I'm afraid, Mom, not just of losing you to cancer, though that terrifies me. I'm afraid of what I've become. Someone who would put her own mother in a basement to impress. People whose approval ultimately means nothing. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears. When did I turn into someone I wouldn't even like? The question hung in the air between us. Honest, raw, and without easy answer. I had wondered the same. Many times over the years, watching my bright, compassionate daughter transform into a social climbing stranger. We rarely recognize our own transformations while they're happening, I finally replied. Each small compromise, each minor betrayal of our values seems insignificant in isolation. It's only when we're confronted with the accumulated result that we see how far we've strayed. She nodded, absorbing this. How do I find my way back? That, I said gently, is a journey only you can navigate. The discharge process took several more hours. Octavia handled the paperwork, consulted with the pharmacist about my medications, and arranged for a wheelchair to transport me to her car, the first time she had driven me anywhere in nearly a decade. The role reversal was pronounced, the daughter caring for the mother who had always been self-sufficient. As we drove toward my brownstone, Octavia broke the companionable silence. I spoke with Kingston this morning after his meeting with Eleonora. The property transfer is complete. Good, I said simply. The lease agreement will be ready tomorrow. He's struggling with this, she admitted. Not just the financial implications, but the loss of control. His family has always owned property, never rented. It feels like failure to him. Perspective is a powerful thing, I observed. To me, building something from nothing represents success, not failure. Perhaps Kingston needs to reevaluate his metrics. She sighed. It's more complicated than that. His identity is tied to certain expectations, continuing his family's legacy, maintaining appearances, achieving specific markers of success. And your identity? I asked. Is it still defined by his expectations? By the Wellington family standards? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She navigated through a yellow light before responding. I don't know anymore. For so long, I've measured myself by how well I fit into Kingston's world. Now that world is shifting beneath my feet. We arrived at my brownstone, where Octavia insisted on helping me inside despite my protests that I could manage. She settled me on the living room sofa, arranged my medications on the kitchen counter according to the schedule, and placed a glass of water and my phone within easy reach. I've taken the liberty of stocking your refrigerator, she said, moving about the kitchen with surprising familiarity. Simple foods that should be gentle on your system during recovery, and I've programmed medication reminders into your phone. I observed these practical ministrations with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. Thank you. This is unexpected. She paused, meeting my gaze across the kitchen island. Is it really so surprising that I would want to care for you? Given recent history? Yes, I answered honestly, but I appreciate the effort. She nodded, accepting the qualified thanks without protest. I should go. Kingston is expecting me home to discuss the lease details. But I'll come by tomorrow to check on you and bring dinner. Is there anything specific you'd like? I shook my head, suddenly exhausted from the procedure and emotional strain of the past few days. Whatever is convenient, My appetite is limited anyway. She gathered her purse and keys, then hesitated at the door. Mom, thank you for letting me help today. I know you could have hired someone. The simple acknowledgement touched me more than I expected. You're welcome, I replied softly. After she departed, I sat in the quiet of my home, contemplating the strange new terrain we were navigating together. Mother and daughter, property owner and tenant, patient and caregiver. My phone chimed with a text from Eleonora. Transfer complete, lease being prepared, call when you're feeling up to it. I sent a brief acknowledgement, then leaned back against the sofa cushions, allowing the medication to dull the ache in my abdomen. The property transfer had been necessary, a correction of boundaries long overdue, but I found myself wondering about the consequences, both intended and unforeseen. How would this realignment of power affect Kingston's relationship with Octavia? How would it influence my daughter's sense of self as she navigated this forced humbling? And beneath these practical considerations lay the more fundamental question. Could meaningful reconciliation grow from such contested ground? The following week passed in a blur of recovery and preparation. The stent successfully relieved the pressure on my bile duct, dramatically reducing my discomfort and jaundice. Octavia visited daily, bringing carefully prepared meals and attending to household tasks without being asked. Kingston made a single appearance, stiff, formal, but civil, to discuss specific terms of the lease agreement, which had been finalized without significant objection from their side. On Sunday evening, my last night before chemotherapy began, Octavia arrived carrying not dinner as expected, but a large portfolio and several file boxes. What's all this? I asked, watching as she arranged the materials on my dining table. Research, she replied simply, about Mercer Pharmaceuticals. I spent the weekend in the company archives, reviewing study results, clinical trials, patient testimonials. She opened the portfolio, revealing carefully organized sections labeled, by drug development timeline. I wanted to understand what you and Dad built, really understand it, beyond the financial benefits it provided me. I moved closer, examining the meticulous compilation with surprise. The archives aren't publicly accessible. How did you gain entry? I called Landry's transition team and explained who I was. They were surprisingly accommodating once they confirmed my identity. She smiled faintly. It seems the founder's daughter still carries some weight, even if I never earned it through actual involvement. I sat at the table, leafing through the materials she had gathered, clinical trial results for our first breakthrough drug, patent applications in my late husband's handwriting, photographs of research teams celebrating FDA approvals. Memories both painful and triumphant. Why now? I asked, looking up at her. After all these years of disinterest? Octavia sat across from me, her expression serious. Because I realized I've spent my life trying to escape a legacy I never bothered to understand. I rejected my background to pursue Kingston's world without recognizing the value of what I was leaving behind. She pulled out a particular file, patient testimonials from recipients of our rare disease treatments. Did you know there are support groups specifically for patients whose lives were saved by Mercer medications? I found online forums where they share stories about how their quality of life improved after treatment. I nodded. Yes, I receive their newsletter quarterly. Of course you do, she murmured, more to herself than to me. You've always paid attention to the impact, not just the profit. Your father insisted on that priority from the beginning, I explained. Revenue was necessary but secondary to patient outcomes. That philosophy shaped every decision we made. Octavia flipped through more documents, pausing at a newspaper clipping about Nathaniel's early research. I've been living as if the most important thing about me was marrying into the Wellington family, when in reality, being the daughter of Mercer Pharmaceuticals founders is probably the most significant aspect of my identity. The admission, hung between us, a recognition long overdue. It's not too late to engage with that heritage, I offered, even with the company sale proceeding. She looked up, something hopeful flickering in her expression. What do you mean? The Landry acquisition includes provisions for continuing our research focus and maintaining key personnel. They've expressed interest in establishing a foundation in your father's name to fund further studies in his specific areas of interest. I hesitated before adding, they've asked if a family representative would consider chairing the board. Understanding dawned in her eyes. They meant me. They meant me initially, I corrected gently. But given my diagnosis, I suggested they might consider you for the role eventually, if you demonstrated genuine interest and aptitude. You never mentioned this. You never expressed interest in the company beyond its financial benefits to you, I countered. Why would I burden you with responsibility you clearly didn't want? She absorbed this silently, her fingers tracing the edge of a research paper. I'd like to learn, she finally said. Whether it leads to a role with the foundation or not, I want to understand what you and Dad created. For the first time in years, I glimpsed the daughter I had raised. Curious, determined, capable of growth when properly motivated. Whether this transformation would last remained to be seen, but the effort itself deserved acknowledgement. I can help with that, I offered carefully. Between treatment sessions, when I have the energy. She nodded, something like relief crossing her features. We spent the next hour reviewing the materials she had gathered, with me providing context and background beyond what the formal records revealed. It was the longest substantive conversation we'd had about Mercer Pharmaceuticals in decades, perhaps ever. As evening deepened, Octavia began packing the documents away. I should let you rest. Tomorrow will be challenging with the first chemotherapy session. Yes, I agreed, suddenly aware of the fatigue settling over me. It's likely to be quite difficult. She hesitated, then asked, would you like me to go with you? I've already arranged to take the day off. The offer surprised me. What about Kingston? Won't he object to your involvement in this? Distraction? A flash of something resolve, perhaps, crossed her features. Kingston's opinions are becoming less central to my decision-making. Some things matter more than his comfort or convenience. The statement marked a significant departure from her previous deference to her husband's preferences. I wondered if this represented a temporary reaction to our recent confrontations or a more fundamental shift in their relationship dynamic. Yes, I said after a moment's consideration. I would appreciate your company tomorrow. She nodded, seeming pleased by the acceptance. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. One more thing. Kingston and I have been discussing the Blue Room, your room in the house. He initially wanted to leave it as a guest room, but I've convinced him it should be properly furnished for your specific needs during treatment. I'd like your input on the setup. The concession might seem minor to an outsider, but I recognized its significance. Kingston had clearly resisted the idea of formalizing my presence in his home, even though it now legally belonged to me. Octavia's insistence on preparing the space properly suggested she was prioritizing my needs over her husband's comfort, a noteworthy inversion of her usual pattern. Thank you, I said simply. That would be helpful. After she left, I sat, in the quiet of my living room, contemplating the subtle shifts occurring between us. The property transfer had been a drastic measure, a response to years of accumulated disrespect culminating in the basement incident. I had expected it to create distance between us, perhaps even rupture our relationship entirely. Instead, it seemed to be forcing a long-overdue reckoning. The chemotherapy regimen began Monday morning at Massachusetts General Hospital's Cancer Center, a state-of-the-art facility where patients in various stages of treatment filled the infusion room. Octavia accompanied me as promised, carrying A tote bag she had prepared with items the oncology nurse had recommended: warm socks, hard candies for metallic taste, a lightweight blanket, headphones, and several books. As the nurses established my IV line and began the pre-medication protocol, Octavia sat beside me, observing the procedure with focused attention. When the actual chemotherapy drugs began flowing, she watched the clear liquid moving through the tubing with something approaching reverence. "These compounds," she said quietly, "they were developed by researchers like Dad, weren't they? People who spent years in laboratories testing formulations, most of which failed, just to find the few that worked?" I nodded. "Yes. Though pharmaceutical research has advanced significantly since your father's time, the basic process remains the same: systematic investigation through trial and error, with occasional breakthroughs that change everything." She considered this. "I never thought about the human effort behind these treatments, the thousands of hours of work that make this possible." "Most people don't," I acknowledged. "They see only the end product and its cost." The session lasted 4 hours. Initially, I felt reasonably well, engaged in conversation and able to read comfortably. But as the drugs accumulated in my system, fatigue and nausea gradually intensified. By the final hour, I was fighting to maintain composure, unwilling to display weakness even in these circumstances. Octavia noticed anyway. Without comment, she adjusted the room's lighting, requested anti-nausea medication from the nurse, and positioned herself between me and other patients who had visitors, creating a small buffer of privacy. When the session finally ended, she helped me to the car with subtle support that preserved my dignity while acknowledging my compromised state. The ride home was silent, not from tension, but from mutual understanding that conversation required energy I no longer possessed. At my brownstone, she settled me into bed with efficiency that surprised me, turning down covers, arranging pillows, placing water and medications within reach, all without unnecessary chatter or hovering. "I'll stay until you're asleep," she said, sitting in the armchair near the bed. The nurse said the first 24 hours can be unpredictable. Too exhausted to argue, I closed my eyes, drifting in and out of consciousness as the powerful drugs worked through my system. Some point, I became aware of Octavia's voice, not speaking to me, but on the phone with someone, her tone uncharacteristically firm. "No, I won't be home tonight. Mom needs monitoring after the first treatment. Yes, I understand the dinner is important to you. Then reschedule it or go without me. This isn't negotiable, Kingston." The unfamiliar assertiveness in her voice was the last thing I registered before slipping into deeper sleep. The next morning, I woke to find Octavia still there, curled awkwardly in the armchair, her blazer folded neatly over the ottoman. She had stayed the entire night, contrary to my expectations. When she stirred and saw me watching her, she straightened immediately. "How are you feeling?" she asked, moving to check my temperature with the back of her hand against my forehead, a gesture so maternal it momentarily disoriented me. "Like I've been poisoned," I replied truthfully, which, technically, I have. She smiled faintly at the gallows humor. The oncology nurse called to check in. She said the nausea should peak today and then gradually improve until the next session. I attempted to sit up, my muscles protesting the movement. Octavia immediately assisted, arranging pillows behind me with practiced ease. "You seem surprisingly adept at this," I observed. "I've been reading everything I could find about pancreatic cancer treatment and side effect management," she explained. "Medical journals, patient forums, caregiver guides." She hesitated. "I wanted to be prepared, to be actually helpful, not just performatively present." The distinction wasn't lost on me. She was acknowledging her tendency toward appearance over substance. Before I could respond, she continued. "I've arranged to work remotely for the rest of the week. My assistant is rescheduling non-essential meetings, and I've spoken with my director about adjusting project timelines." I frowned. "Octavia, This isn't necessary. I've hired home health aides for precisely this purpose. I know, she said simply. But I want to be here. Not out of obligation, but because I've missed too much already. She adjusted my blanket with careful hands. I spent years avoiding meaningful involvement in your life, Mom. I don't want to continue that pattern when our time together may be limited. The words hung between us, honest, vulnerable, acknowledging the gravity of my diagnosis without descending into maudlin sentiment. For the first time since the basement incident, I allowed myself to consider that perhaps Octavia's transformation wasn't merely a temporary reaction to financial leverage or cancer-induced guilt, but the beginning of a genuine reassessment. Kingston can't be pleased with this arrangement, I noted, testing the depth of her commitment. Something hardened in her expression. Kingston's pleasure has dictated too many of my choices for too long. He'll adapt or... She didn't complete the thought, but the implication was clear. Or? I prompted. She met my gaze directly. Or he won't. Either way, I'm staying. The simple declaration represented a seismic shift in priorities, one I hadn't anticipated when I transferred the house into my name. My goal had been to reclaim my dignity and establish appropriate boundaries, not necessarily to disrupt Octavia's marriage. Yet here we were, watching the first fractures appear in a relationship built partly on mutual pretense. Be careful, Octavia, I cautioned. Moments of crisis often inspire dramatic declarations that become difficult to sustain when normalcy returns. This isn't a declaration, she countered. It's a decision. There's a difference. She checked her watch. It's time for your anti-nausea medication. Do you think you could manage some tea and toast? The conversation shifted to immediate practicalities. What I could eat, which medications needed to be taken with food, how to manage the crushing fatigue without disrupting my sleep schedule. Throughout the day, Octavia moved between caring for me and handling her work responsibilities, her laptop set up at my dining table where she could hear if I needed assistance. By evening, I was feeling marginally better, still profoundly fatigued, but with slightly less nausea. Octavia prepared a simple dinner of clear broth and crackers, which I managed to consume without incident. As we sat in the living room afterward, she broached a subject we had carefully avoided. I'd like to start moving some of your things to the blue room at the house, she said. Just the essentials for now, comfortable clothes, preferred toiletries, whatever would make your stays easier during treatment. I considered the proposal. You don't think that's presumptuous? I haven't yet decided how frequently I'll use the room. The chemotherapy schedule suggests you'll need a place to rest between treatments, especially as fatigue accumulates with successive sessions, she pointed out practically. My house, your house, is closer to the hospital than this brownstone. Logistically, it makes sense to have the option ready. Her reasoning was sound, but I suspected another motivation beneath the practicality. And Kingston? How does he feel about this arrangement? She hesitated before answering. He's adjusting to the new reality. It's difficult for him. The house transfer, my increased involvement in your care, the changing dynamics between us. But he's making an effort. At your insistence, I observed. Yes, she acknowledged without apology. At my insistence. I nodded, recognizing the subtle but significant power shift this represented. Octavia, who had spent years conforming to Kingston's preferences and social aspirations, was now asserting her own priorities with newfound confidence. Very well, I agreed. We can begin preparations for the blue room, but understand this isn't a commitment to any particular living arrangement. I value my independence. Of course, she said quickly. It's simply an option, available whenever you need it. As she helped me prepare for bed that evening, Octavia moved with a quiet efficiency that reminded me, unexpectedly, of myself. I had always approached problems methodically, with practical solutions rather than emotional indulgence. Watching her manage my care with similar pragmatism, I wondered how much of myself existed in her, dormant but not destroyed by years of social posturing. "You should go home tonight," I told her as she arranged my medications for the morning. "I'm stable, and you need proper rest." She shook her head. "I'll stay one more night just to be certain. The nurse said the second night can sometimes be worse than the first." "Kingston will be waiting," I reminded her. A fleeting expression crossed her features, something between resignation and resolve. "Yes, he will." 3 months into my chemotherapy, the oncology team scheduled a comprehensive evaluation to assess the tumor's response. The intervening weeks had been brutal, each session leaving me progressively weaker, the powerful drugs manifesting in hair loss, debilitating, fatigue, persistent nausea, and neuropathy in my hands and feet. Yet alongside this physical deterioration, something unexpected had flourished, a genuine reconnection with Octavia. True to her word, she remained consistently present throughout my treatment journey, balancing her professional responsibilities with unwavering commitment to my care. She attended every chemotherapy session, managed my medication schedule with military precision, and transformed the Blue Room at her house, my house, into a comfortable refuge for my recovery days. Most significantly, we addressed the fractures in our relationship with unprecedented candor. Octavia acknowledged how thoroughly she had sacrificed authenticity for social acceptance, while I confronted my own failures, the emotional distance I had maintained even while providing material support, the way I had enabled her entitled behavior by never establishing proper boundaries. Kingston's adaptation had been less successful. While maintaining surface civility during my visits, his resentment simmered just beneath the polished veneer. He treated the property transfer as a temporary arrangement, speaking of when things returned to normal, in ways that revealed his expectation that my illness or death would eventually restore his ownership. This assumption particularly grated on Octavia, whose awareness of her husband's character flaws had sharpened dramatically. Their arguments became more frequent and pointed. The Blue Room's proximity to their bedroom made certain heated exchanges unavoidable. "She's not a guest we're tolerating, Kingston. She's my mother and the legal owner of this house. And when she's gone? What then? We'll have wasted months catering to her demands only to find ourselves back where we started, but with your career damaged by all these absences, if that's your primary concern, my career trajectory rather than my mother's life, perhaps we need to reevaluate more than just our living arrangements." On the morning of my evaluation scan, Octavia arrived earlier than necessary, bringing freshly baked muffins and ginger tea. As we prepared to leave, she received a call from Kingston. I heard only her side of the conversation, but her responses told the story. "No, I won't be able to make it. Because today is Mom's evaluation scan, as I've mentioned at least 3 times this week. Yes, it's that important. I understand it's your mother's birthday lunch, but this literally concerns whether my mother lives or dies, so I think that takes precedence." After ending the call, she explained, "Kingston's mother's birthday lunch. Apparently, my absence is causing talk among the family. God forbid something disrupt their carefully orchestrated social calendar." The scan itself was routine, the same uncomfortable procedure I had undergone for my initial diagnosis. The waiting that followed, however, was excruciating. When Dr. Patel finally appeared, her expression gave nothing away, the practiced neutrality of a physician who had delivered both miracles and death sentences. "The tumor has responded to treatment," she began. "It's reduced in size by approximately 40%, and there remains no evidence of metastasis to surrounding organs." Relief washed over me, so powerful I briefly closed my eyes against unexpected tears. Octavia released a shaky breath she seemed to have been holding since we arrived. "Given these results, I recommend we continue the current chemotherapy protocol. For another 6 weeks, then reassess for possible surgical intervention. The surgery she referenced would be extensive, a pancreaticoduodenectomy, commonly known as the Whipple procedure. Complex and risky under the best circumstances, it represented both opportunity and danger. Your response rate places you in a more favorable category, Dr. Patel continued. I would now estimate your 5-year survival probability at close to 40%, possibly higher if surgery is successful. 40%, still less than even odds, but substantially better than the 30% she had initially offered. As Octavia drove us back to my brownstone, she broke our reflective silence with unexpected decisiveness. I want you to move into the house permanently during treatment and recovery. The blue room is already set up. There's more space for any equipment you might need, and having you there would simplify logistics considerably. Kingston would object, I pointed out. He barely tolerates my occasional stays now. Kingston's preferences are becoming increasingly irrelevant to my decision-making. Besides, it's your house. You have every right to live in it. That evening, my phone rang with an unexpected caller. Theodore Wellington, Kingston's father. I understand you received promising medical news today, he began. I'm actually calling about a different matter. We're prepared to offer full repayment of the original down payment amount, plus a generous premium, let's say an additional $150,000, in exchange for transferring the property back to Kingston and Octavia before your surgery. The naked opportunism was breathtaking. Theodore had calculated that major surgery presented an ideal moment to resolve the property situation, while I was vulnerable, focused on survival rather than legal minutia. Theodore, let me be perfectly clear, I responded after a moment. The house remains mine. It will continue to be mine throughout my treatment, recovery, and beyond. No amount of money will change that decision. After ending the call, I texted Octavia, Your father-in-law just attempted to buy the house back. Thought you should know. Her response came immediately, I'm coming over. This stops now. Within the hour, she arrived at my brownstone, face flushed with barely contained fury. Kingston had followed her, his expression alternating between defensive and alarmed. Did Theodore call you directly or go through an attorney? She demanded. Direct call, I confirmed. He framed it as concern for my well-being, unburdening me of property responsibilities during treatment. Kingston stepped forward. Octavia, my father was trying to help. He thought he could exploit a sick woman's vulnerability to regain control of an expensive asset, she cut in sharply. Using her cancer diagnosis as leverage, it's despicable. Octavia turned to face him fully, something resolute settling in her posture. I'm concerned about my mother's present, about her dignity, about the fact that your family continues to treat her as an obstacle rather than a human being deserving of basic respect. We're trying to find a solution that works for everyone, Kingston insisted, though the argument sounded hollow. No, Octavia said quietly. You're trying to find a solution that restores your family's pride and social standing. Those aren't my priorities anymore, Kingston. They haven't been since I realized what they cost me. This isn't you, Octavia. You've always understood the importance of position, of perception. We've built our life around certain standards, certain expectations. No, she corrected him. We built our life around your expectations. I just contorted myself to fit them. I'm done contorting. What are you saying? He finally asked. I'm saying my mother will be moving into the blue room permanently during her treatment and recovery, as is her right as the property owner. I'm saying your father's manipulative tactics end now, and I'm saying you need to decide whether you can adapt to these new realities or not. And if I can't adapt, then we have much bigger problems than housing arrangements. 2 days. Later, Kingston returned from a trip to New York. The next morning, Octavia appeared at breakfast, looking exhausted, but oddly serene. Kingston is moving out, she said without preamble. Temporarily, he says, but we both know it's more than that. His family has given him an ultimatum of their own. Either he resolves the property situation by whatever means necessary, or his position at the family firm will be reconsidered. And you? I asked. I told him I wouldn't be leveraged, manipulated, or pressured into destroying the fragile peace we've established here. That his family's priorities are no longer mine, that I'm not ashamed of where I came from or who my mother is. In the weeks that followed, my treatment continued with encouraging results, each scan showing further tumor reduction. The Landry biotech acquisition of Mercer Pharmaceuticals was finalized, with provisions for a research foundation in Nathaniel's name. Octavia was invited to join the foundation's inaugural board, not as a courtesy, but in recognition of her intensive self-education about her father's scientific legacy. My final pre-surgical evaluation confirmed the tumor had reduced sufficiently for surgery. 2 weeks later, as Octavia and I returned from the hospital with this news, we found Kingston waiting in our foyer, dressed in a business suit, his expression uncharacteristically subdued. My parents attended the Mercer Foundation launch today, he explained. They were impressed. Several of our banking clients approached them afterward, complimenting their daughter-in-law's eloquence and connection to such meaningful work. How convenient, Octavia observed dryly. Suddenly, my background is acceptable now that it has public validation from the right people. Kingston looked uncomfortable. I was wrong. We were wrong. About many things. He removed several documents from his portfolio. My family would like to propose a new arrangement, a formal acknowledgement of Vivian's ownership, with a proper lease agreement for Octavia and me, if reconciliation is something you're open to considering. And if I refuse? Octavia asked. If I prefer to continue our separation? The lease offer would extend to you individually in that case. My family recognizes the importance of stability during Vivian's treatment and recovery. After Kingston departed, Octavia turned to me. What are you thinking? I think that depends on whether Kingston's reassessment is genuine or merely expedient. Has he truly recognized the value in your background, your priorities, or has he simply adjusted his strategy because his family has recalculated the social equation? She nodded slowly. That's the question, isn't it? People can change, I'm evidence of that, but change born of convenience rarely lasts beyond its usefulness. Trust your instincts, I advised. You've rediscovered your authentic self through this process. Listen to what that self is telling you about Kingston's potential for similar growth. As we worked together that evening, preparing for my upcoming surgery, I reflected on our journey since that night I had been relegated to the basement. The property transfer that had seemed like an extreme response had become the foundation for genuine healing, not just between Octavia and me, but within Octavia herself. Whether her marriage would survive remained uncertain. Whether my treatment would ultimately succeed was still an open question. But sitting in the Blue Room, now adapted as my recovery space through my daughter's thoughtful attention, I knew with absolute certainty that I had reclaimed something more valuable than property. I had reclaimed my dignity, my daughter's respect, and our relationship, transformed through crisis into something authentic and enduring. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, no longer separated by basement floors or social pretensions, but united in mutual understanding and genuine care. The house was simply a structure. The healing that had occurred within its walls was the true victory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.